Colfax is officially 160 years old back in September. That's when the railroad first arrived here, and the town was formed by the railroad. So that was, it was a railroad town then. It's always been a railroad town. Probably always will be a railroad town. Not everybody's happy about that sometimes, but that's our history. The railroad arrived here in 1865. This was the original transcontinental railroad, the first one across the country. And it gradually started building from Sacramento, and gradually moved up to an area here, reached here in September of 1865. And that was 160 years ago. But what I'm going to talk about is some of the changes that have happened since the railroad got here. We'll start out at that 1865 point. But a lot of changes took place in town here, and some of those changes were kind of subtle, but some of them were pretty major too. When the railroad first arrived in Colfax, Colfax wasn't very much here, but some significant things to point out in this. First of all, over at this end there was a hillside that had to go around. I created this little chart to kind of show a way of looking at things as we look at these various time frames. This is the tracks you see today coming across right through here at an angle. At the time the railroad was built, they couldn't put the tracks there because there were hills in the way. Those two hills I talked about, each end of town. So instead they went around a hill, through town, and then went around another hill at this end. So here's the first of those historic pictures. This is what it looked like in the 1865, 1866 time frame, when just after the railroad arrived. You can't see it here, right here, but there's a street that comes down here called Depot Street. And the reason it was called Depot Street is because it went across the tracks to the passenger depot, which is the building right here. On this side, or the Main Street side of the tracks, they had a big, long, about a 500-foot long freight shed. Again, Main Street is right about here. Notice there's no tall brick buildings in that picture. The Oddfellows building and the Masonic Lodge that you see over here when you look at the profile of town, those were actually dedicated in 1868. Here's Depot Street. It actually crossed the tracks at that time. Passenger depot was right here. This freight shed was right here, about 500 feet long. It actually extended beyond, it started near Depot Street, extended beyond what is now Grass Valley Street. So that Grass Valley Street crossing did not exist at this time. In 1876, about 10 years after the railroad first arrived, the Nevada County Narrow Gauge was built. It started operating in 1876. Its tracks came in on the far side of the passenger depot and kind of extended down here. They needed a way to transfer cargo from the narrow gauge trains to the standard gauge trains. And they also didn't need, by 1876, they didn't need that huge, long, 500-foot long freight shed. So they built a new building right here and called it the Freight Depot. And that is exactly the same building you see over here. But looking at the map again, now after the 1881 building, and I didn't mention that specifically, the Freight Depot was built in 1881. County Narrow Gauge ran from here to Grass Valley, Nevada City. And that's a windy road over there. They didn't have the same ability to well, long straight stretches. Narrow gauge are a lot better for tight curves, and to make tight curves. And it's also somewhat cheaper to build. And they just needed a way to get cargo from Colfax over to the mines and also to haul like gold back this way. But 1884, the people that built the Central Pacific also built a line that was going down in the San Joaquin Valley. They bought a line that was building south from San Francisco heading down towards Los Angeles. They also started a line going up north towards Oregon. So they folded all those under an umbrella holding company called Southern Pacific Company. We'll go back now to the 1900 time frame and talk about that same issue we talked about before. This is looking the opposite direction from the hillside over this way, looking past. This is the passenger depot. Here's the downtown buildings, and that's that transfer shed I talked about. So in 1905, there was a number of different changes now. If you remember from the picture before, this freight depot, when it was built, was on this side of the tracks. 1905, what they want to do is they want to get the freight depot and the transfer shed moved to the other side of the tracks. So now it's between the Southern Pacific tracks and the Nevada County narrow gauge tracks. Talk about some of the other features in here. This hotel was built in 1903. This hotel was built in about 1906, 1907. I'm talking about 1905 changes here in terms of the railroad buildings, but some of the other buildings in here tell us more about this photo. We know it was taken after 1907 because of that building. That's the Marvin Hotel.
Those pictures are a relatively high resolution for 120 years old. Were the pictures taken at that time, 1905?
They were pictures, these are all pictures taken at that time. A lot of these were done with glass plate negatives, which is a whole different process and creates some very high resolution photos. You have the transfer shed and the freight depot on the other side of the tracks, extending beyond Depot Street. Depot Street's no longer a crossing now. Okay, we now have improved arrangements of equipment in town, the buildings, but there's still a single track railroad, which means you have uphill traffic and downhill traffic competing for wanting to be on different segments of the track. So the way to deal with that, at least temporarily, was to establish something called a staff system or staff stations. Roughly every 3 miles along the run from basically Rockland all the way to Truckee, there would be one of these staff stations. Some of them already existed. For instance, Colfax became a staff station as well as a regular depot on that section of track. So that was the way they handled the uphill, downhill conflict on traffic. Indicated some of them were telegraph offices already, which meant it was already a staffed telegraph station. But some of them, they had to actually hire extra people to be there to staff these staff stations. We do have a picture here of one of the staff stations. This was actually in the snow sheds at Soda Springs. Pretty basic, unless it was a telegraph station as well. We still haven't fixed the fundamental problem of uphill and downhill traffic. So in 1909, started a project to double track the line. So at Newcastle, the two tracks diverged from Rockland and then came back together at Newcastle. They actually altered the old original track a little bit right here when it came into Newcastle. This is the new eastbound track, again, left-hand running, like the British do on the wrong side of the road. In Auburn had a little issue going on here because they're building the new track, but they have to get across Auburn Ravine, which is where the freeway now goes under the trestle in there. They laid temporary track down Sacramento Street Bridge. So this is the track coming up from Newcastle, the new track, and they're starting to build out across this ravine. Notice if you look carefully here, there's a whole bunch of people over here watching this. Another area where it's kind of interesting construction is near Applegate. Again, as we go up through the areas, you now have the new eastbound track in the lower area, and trying to maintain a steady grade going up. The old track is this much higher than the new track. In Colfax, where we see the significant major changes that took place as part of this double tracking effort. So this is a picture taken from Oak Street. If you stand near the Oak Street, look at the hillside behind it. If you go on the hillside across on South Main Street down here and look, if you were to look down before all the trees grew up there, because you can't see it so well anymore, you would see the engine house very clearly, and the Y track is kind of bending up behind. There were two 882 wheel arrangement, which is almost like two of those consolidations back to back, but you only had a single boiler and a single firebox, so they were more efficient to run than two of the smaller locomotives hooked together. They actually ordered two of them that came not cab forward, but then the next ones they said turn them around, and they started delivering them as a cab forward or cab ahead design. And this is what you see here now. This again. Now they wouldn't always smoke that badly, but they certainly would when they're climbing. And if you're in a snow shed and you're living in the midst of all that, you're very glad that your cab is out in front of that. So in 1913, basically we've got all of the major work done up to Grass Valley Street. We got the bump ahead to 1915. Transfer shed that was attached to it for the pneumatic line narrow gauge, they don't want to move it over there because it's the wrong side of the tracks. So they built the shed down here. And above here in 1913, 1914, they had a dilemma now. They want to double track this, but that cut around Cape Horn, so they decided instead of going around Cape Horn with the second track, they would go through the tunnels, 2 tunnels that they built. There was one other major place where a significant change was done as part of the double tracking. That was at Donner Summit. There's a story in itself in terms of the Chinese workers that cranked through those tunnels, yes.
When they built that tunnel, did they start from opposite ends and work toward the middle?
Talk about the Summit Tunnel. They actually started originally on the Summit Tunnel, Tunnel 6, which is the first of these, from each end, but it was going very slowly. So they punched the shaft down the center, which of course took a while to do that too, because it's still going through granite. And then they started working outward from that center shaft. So they're actually working on 4 fronts to cut that tunnel through there. And everything came out all matched up, and everything worked. But it greatly accelerated the completion of that tunnel back in 1867. There were 2 highways that originally came through this area, one called the Victory Highway and one the Lincoln Highway. And they kind of just meandered around wherever they needed to go. And of course, they're going through the same general area as the railroad. So a lot of places, the roads crossed the tracks. When Highway 40 was created, that was the first of the government highways, a nationwide highway. The intent was to try to get it so you had no at-grade crossings for the highway traffic. So we started looking at places where right now you go along here and you want to follow Highway 40, you have to cross the railroad tracks, which creates 2 problems. In 1939, a bypass was built, which is now the 174 highway bypass. Probably the most significant of the changes was at Immigrant Gap. A little bit more in terms of the visual changes that we're going to start seeing is diesels are going to start appearing on the scene here now. And in fact, the first diesels appeared in this area on the city of San Francisco. This was a premier train that was formed by 3 railroads, the Chicago Northwestern from Chicago to Omaha, Union Pacific from Omaha to Salt Lake City. But an unfortunate circumstance that happened right here during this time frame in World War II. In 1944, a train wreck happened at Lander. It made the national news because it was a troop train. What you started seeing after World War II is diesel power on, this is a passenger train, not the city of San Francisco. By the 1950s, the steam power was pretty much a thing of the past on this. What really sealed the fate of it was in 1947 to 49, Southern Pacific started buying what were called freight diesels. In 1996, Southern Pacific is going to finally be gobbled up officially by Union Pacific and a merger. But before that happens, Southern Pacific has one last hurrah of a change they want to make. This is again looking at, here's Tunnel 6, the east portal of Tunnel 6, Tunnel 7, and Tunnel 8 beyond that. Southern Pacific train climbing uphill, looking at Tunnel 7 towards Tunnel 8. This is an interesting place if you've never been up there, because from right about here to that tunnel is all on a free-form rock wall called the China Wall. It was built by Chinese workers with no mortar, just carefully placing rocks. With Union Pacific now in command in 1996, we see UP yellow rather than Southern Pacific colors. Today, what's changed? Well, primarily the length of the trains. We're seeing mile-long trains going through town now. Colfax is one of the few places I've been where you can look at pictures of that downtown area in 1900 and 1990 and see the same downtown, basically. The main stable is where City Hall is now.
Over at the booth, there's a 1,000-pound concrete cylindrical phone booth telegraph. And as I understand it, they replace like every 15 miles or so. Could you talk a little bit about that subject?
Yeah, one of the things we don't talk about a lot of times in these kind of things is you have all these trains running back and forth, but you have to have people out there maintaining the track. You used to have track walkers, people would actually just walk the track, look for any kind of defects. But then it kind of evolved into maintenance of way people that would go out on little motor cars or something like that to check the condition of the track. And they would have these phone booths scattered along the route that they could use to contact somebody if they found a defect of any sort. So yeah, those little concrete phone booths were a very regular thing spread out along the route where. Questions? Thank you all for coming.